speakers today are Toby Walsh, Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and Chair of Section T of AAAS, Information, Computing, and Communication. Also, Peter Acero, Associate Professor of Media Studies at the New School in New York, and Mary Wareham, Coordinator of the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. Our briefing will run for about 45 minutes today, after which we'll have a hard stop. If you have additional questions for our speakers, we can move to a room outside of this one. Without further ado, Toby Walsh.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very much an accidental activist. I'm a scientist. I spent my whole life working on artificial intelligence ever since I read too much science fiction as a young boy. And the last few years, I've become, like many of my colleagues, very concerned about how the technology can be misused. Like most technologies, it can be used for good or for bad. There's plentiful good things it can be used in a military context. Clearing minefields, a perfect job for a robot. But equally, I and my colleagues are very concerned that we will hand over decisions to machines as to who lives and who dies, and that would be a disastrous turn for humanity. So I've organized a panel tomorrow, which I hope you will all come along to from 1:30 to 3 o'clock, which will feature Mary, Peter, and Ryan, who sends his apologies he can't make it here today, entitled Killer Robots, Technological, Legal, and Ethical Challenges. Before there's any confusion, before you start searching for that image of Terminator, we are not talking about Terminator. We're talking about much simpler technologies that are at best a few years away. In fact, many of which you can see under development today in every theater of the war. In the air, autonomous drones, like the Tranis drone that BAE Systems has under development. On the sea, autonomous ships that can cross the Pacific, like the US Navy's first fully autonomous ship, the Sea Hunter, which just completed its first fully autonomous voyage from Hawaii back to the Californian coast. Under the sea, fully autonomous submarines that can cross the Pacific, like the Boeing's autonomous submarine that's the size of a bus. And on the land, autonomous vehicles like Russia's Mk-25 autonomous tank and Samsung's Sentry robot. It is therefore very timely that we should be talking about it. It's very timely because just at the beginning of this week, we had President Trump announce an executive order promoting the American Artificial Intelligence Initiative, which called on significant federal investment in R&D in AI, including in the military space, but also raised the concern that we should foster public trust in AI. And as I'm sure Mary is going to be telling us shortly, the public has little trust, and that little trust is decreasing towards the use of AI in the battlefield. It's also very timely because this week we saw the US Department of Defense release its AI strategy. One of the four pillars, one of the four foci of that is in AI ethics and safety. In the panel, we'll discuss the arguments for autonomous weapons. There are arguments to be had for autonomous weapons. Perhaps they might reduce collateral damage. Perhaps we will get soldiers out of harm's way. But as you will certainly hear during the course of the discussion, those arguments don't hold up to much scrutiny. And there are many more arguments against the use of autonomous weapons, that they will change the speed and duration of warfare. They will be a step change in the way we fight. It's been called, rightly so, the third revolution in warfare. That it will reduce the barriers to conflict, that they will increase the already delicate geopolitical situation, upset the current balance of power that we see between militaries. And also fundamental moral ethical issues, that they will cross a red line if we hand these decisions to machines, because machines do not have the moral capability today, or I suspect ever, to be able to take these sorts of decisions. 4 years ago, I was sufficiently concerned that with some colleagues, we organized an open letter to the United Nations that was signed by thousands of my colleagues, that was probably reported by many of your news organizations. We warned then of an arms race. You can see that arms race is already starting to take place between nations by arms companies around the world. We warned that this technology would be easy to produce. And tomorrow I will also be making an announcement that we'll be launching the world's first killer drone hackathon. I'll be inviting members of the public to explore how easy it will be to build such technology in the very near future. We'll be running an observational experiment. At the end of this hackathon, I expect the participants will have become more concerned than they already are about lethal autonomous weapons. Similarly, at the end of our panel, I expect the audience to be, as well, much more concerned about the development of lethal autonomous weapons. And I just want to end my remarks by quoting the words of Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, as he opened the General Assembly at the end of last year. Let's call it as it is. The prospect of weapons with the discretion and power to take human life is morally repugnant. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Peter Acero. In addition to being a professor at the New School, I'm also the co-founder and vice chair of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. And my background is really in philosophy of science and technology. I did a lot of work also in machine learning and robotics, thinking about early cybernetics all the way to the contemporary technologies, and then really started to see the emergence of a lot of these military technologies and the growing autonomy that was being incorporated into these systems. And back in 2009, I got together with some colleagues and we co-founded the International Committee for Robot Arms Control as an organization that brings together scientists, technologists, computer scientists, roboticists, but also philosophers, lawyers, and international relations experts to try to get a discussion going about the international implications and hopefully a treaty about this. And then in 2012, we joined together with a group of NGOs to form the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. And we've since been lobbying at the United Nations to get an international treaty to prohibit fully autonomous weapons systems. And we define these, of course, not as Terminators or simply remote-controlled drones and so forth, but we follow the International Committee of the Red Cross's working definition of autonomous weapons, which is systems that have autonomy in the critical functions of targeting and engaging lethal weapons. And so these are systems that are using sensors and software processing on their own to determine what constitutes a target and then applying lethal force to that without supervision or meaningful human control. So what we've really been lobbying is not a sort of complete ban on some specific technical capability, but a more general requirement that all weapons systems should have meaningful human control over the targeting and engagement of those weapons systems. More recently, and over the summer, you may have heard something about Project Maven at Google. This was a project that Google had with the Pentagon to develop automatic visual object recognition and identification within drone video feeds that the military is operating. And many of the employees there were very concerned, as were we when they contacted us, that these could be then precursors to automatic targeting for future autonomous drone systems. And then using the kind of full weight of Google's AI technology, expertise, and cloud computing services to process data that could then become a component of an autonomous weapons system. And there were about 7,000 internal Google employees who signed a letter asking Google to terminate that contract and not to engage in weapons development. And my organization, iCrack, organized a letter from scientists and experts in software, information technology, robotics, and computer science. And we got 1,400 scientists to sign a letter supporting the Google workers. And this brought a lot of media pressure on Google, and they subsequently said that they will not renew the contract past its termination date in 2019, and they've subsequently issued a set of AI ethical principles, among which they state explicitly that they will not work on or develop weapons, and that they will design systems that accord with international norms in humanitarian law and human rights law. Of course, right now in the UN, what we're debating is exactly what those norms should be, and we believe the norm should be that there should be no autonomous targeting of weapons, and there should always be meaningful human control, and that we need an internationally binding legal document and treaty to enforce this. Some other things that we've done over the past year, looking at different precursor systems, we organized another letter around Amazon's cloud service face recognition technology, which we also believe should not be used by military and police forces for identifying individuals. And this becomes incredibly dangerous when we start thinking about autonomous targeting in the context of being able to use face recognition technologies, whether those are bad face recognition technologies that have a lot of mistaken identities, or whether those are highly successful identifications, because the nature of warfare is not really an individual attack on specific persons. It's supposed to be, in the Geneva Conventions, state-on-state conflicts, and threats are determined by one's position on a battlefield, not one's face. And so we got about 500 signatures there, and there's some op-eds that we put in the Guardian back in May and June about those letters. But just to add some other concerns around what these technologies might mean, we're also quite fearful that these could constitute a new kind of weapon of mass destruction, to the extent that a small group of people or individuals could launch large numbers of autonomous weapon systems that could have devastating effects on populations. And this creates all sorts of security concerns, and concerns also about arms races between states, proliferation of these sorts of weapons to non-state actors and terrorists. And of course, then there's a whole host of moral, ethical questions around the human rights violations that these systems might create, and the threat to human dignity posed by allowing autonomous weapon systems to determine who lives and dies. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Toby. I'm the last speaker, Mary Wareham from Human Rights Watch. I spend about half of my time supporting our research at Human Rights Watch and advocacy into particularly indiscriminate and inhumane weapons, such as anti-personnel landmines, cluster bombs, incendiary weapons. And in 2012, Human Rights Watch issued its first report on this topic of what we called killer robots. And we called it Losing Humanity, the case against killer robots. You've heard some of the concerns that have been expressed already today. I just wanted to say that it is the scientists, the roboticists, the artificial intelligence experts who first raised the alarm on this challenge, and then came to speak with us at Human Rights Watch and other groups about what we could do. And we decided it was better to cooperate together and form a coalition of groups so that we could have a coordinated movement to push for new international law to preemptively ban fully autonomous weapons. And a preemptive ban means that we're talking about future weapon systems rather than trying to prohibit today's armed drones. Toby's given you lots of examples of autonomy that exists in certain weapon systems today. We're concerned about retaining meaningful human control over the selection and attack of targets and the use of force more generally. This is where the debate is at in Geneva, where governments have been talking about this for the last 6 years. So the campaign is now comprised of 93 non-governmental organizations in 53 countries. We're growing very rapidly now around the world. Our objective is to have a true movement here. We've picked up support, serious support in the last year from the tech workers out in California. Of course, the big company founders have been supportive for a number of years now. 28 countries support the call for a ban. Virtually all countries who've spoken on this topic affirm the importance of human control. So that's the touch point that everybody is focusing on. The diplomacy has been failing, and I can talk about that if you wish. What we're doing in the campaign is focusing our efforts at the national level, and we'll be in Berlin next month, hopefully to talk to the foreign minister there, who's very concerned about this particular weapon system and the future of arms control. And my talk tomorrow, I'm going to look at some statistics that we issued last month in a survey that Ipsos conducted and issued, actually, a 26-country survey. We wanted to return to a question that was asked 2 years ago and see if public views on this challenge are changing. And we found that they certainly are changing. The public is becoming more opposed to the prospect of a weapon system that would remove human control. That was across the board, and including here in the United States. I can give you the link to this. Opposition was strong for both men and for women, although it was men who were more likely to favor these weapon systems compared to women. And we also asked a follow-up question this time to the ones who said that they were opposed. We asked why and gave some examples. 2/3 answered that lethal autonomous weapon systems would cross a moral line because machines should not be allowed to kill. And then more than half also expressed concern that such weapon systems would be unaccountable. So those are a couple more of the objections that are being raised to fully autonomous weapons. And the story hasn't ended yet. We don't know how it will end. We hope that it will end with an international treaty that provides guidance as the norm, stigmatizing the removal of human from the selection and attack process of weapon systems. Or, the gates will open and we'll see proliferation, destabilizing incidents, and from our experts, it's just a bad situation all round if we don't get this new international law now. So thank you.
All right, thank you. We will take questions now. If you could raise your name, we'll bring you a mic, and please state your name and affiliation. We've got a question here in the second row to start.
Thanks very much. Ivan Semenek with the Globe and Mail in Canada. I was going to ask you who you see as your opponents in this effort.
Depends if you want to pick nation states or you want to pick the undoubtable large sums of money that arms companies are going to be making selling the next generation of weapons.
Well, who's most actively opposed, or what? How do you perceive that there might be efforts to derail this or to block this treaty?
You want to say, Mary? I mean,
Sure thing. The talks in Geneva have involved about 80 countries, and the vast majority of them have proposed multiple times now to move from talking to action, to start the process of drafting up the international treaty. And those proposals have been blocked by abuse of the consensus decision-making that they have there. And they're being blocked by some of the most significant military powers. So Russia was the problem last November. The United States also is vehemently opposed to moving to negotiate new international law. Israel and South Korea, who are also developing robotic systems, have not been very helpful at the UN, and neither has Australia. But it's also very rare that these countries want to talk about the possible benefits or advantages of fully autonomous weapons. I think that our stigmatization effort is already having an impact, and that also includes from some of the arms manufacturers. Lockheed Martin put out a very slick promotional video talking about the human, the role of the human. There's a kind of a sense that we can still set the rules in place now that will govern not just war fighting in the future. We're not just concerned about potential use in armed conflict, but also policing, law enforcement, border control. Other circumstances like that have to be dealt with as well.
So I should also say the European Parliament voted in September supporting the ban as well. And since we're shaming nations, I'll shame my mother country, the United Kingdom, which has the farcical argument that existing international humanitarian law is adequate, which is farcical because otherwise why would we have ever introduced any new disarmament treaties for any type of new technology if existing international humanitarian law was going to be adequate? Every time technology comes along, which changes the norms.
Question in the middle, and then we'll come up here to the front. Yeah.
Yes, Robin Williams from the ABC in Australia. You've identified who might be for, but why are they for? Why do they want to keep them? What's the point?
I think their systems are still under development, so it's not so much about keeping, it's about the prospect of what they anticipate those systems might be able to offer. And I think that's typically either a tactical advantage in certain specific kinds of use cases, where they see autonomy as providing benefits. And I think they often wrap it in this language of, well, they'll be more precise, they may be able to reduce civilian casualties, they'll be able to protect our forces, and that sort of rationale, which we hear about sort of any weapon system, really. And I think what they discount, well, of course, what they're looking for is a strategic advantage over competitors. And whether those are large states that are competing and building systems or small regional rivalries between states. And they think they will have an advantage over their neighbors or competitors. But I think that'll be a very short-term advantage. And they haven't really calculated the repercussions of an arms race, the destabilization, the ways in which these systems will operate very differently than other kinds of traditional arms and may undermine existing forms of deterrence and détente that exist, which is why it's very troubling as a destabilizing factor and what the arms races would mean for global security.
The US have called it the third offset. But it's unlikely. You know, it was the same argument that was given when we were in the race to develop the hydrogen bomb. But we didn't, the West didn't keep that secret very long. Russia stole the secret, and they had a hydrogen bomb within a few years. And so these are technologies that are actually much more troubling, because unlike a hydrogen bomb, you're not going to need the resources of a nation state. You're not going to need fissile material. So it's going to be much easier to copy and replicate these technologies himself. So it has to be that the norm is that they're not used. There are plenty of good things that the same technologies will be used. I mean, the same tracking algorithms will go into your autonomous car that will track pedestrians and avoid them, will track combatants on the ground and kill them. And we'll want the former, we won't want the latter.
Seth Borenstein, AP, for Dr. Walsh. Can you go through, obviously you're saying you're only a few short years away, so there are thresholds that have not been crossed, or technological issues, problems that have not been solved. Can you go through what those problems are, how close those technological issues are to being solved? And if you, going back to what you just talked about with autonomous cars, if you have the technology and you have a ban, what is to prevent a non-nation state, a terrorist group or whomever, from using it, even if nation states don't use it?
Right. Interesting question. So let me start with the second one. It's always difficult to ban a technology, right? We're not going to, these are technologies, as I said, that they're going to be used for plentiful, peaceful purposes. And so we are going to develop these technologies. It's the application of these technologies to killing people that we're actually worried about. And the way that you limit that is the same way that we've limited any other technology from the battlefield, which is by making it the norm that it's not used. Chemical weapons don't require a degree in chemistry. They require high school chemistry. They don't require sophistication. And similarly, autonomous weapons aren't going to require huge sophistication. They're going to be easy to get your hands on. But we don't use chemical weapons widely because it's the norm that we don't. And that when they do get used, there are front-page headlines in all the newspapers around the world. There are condemnation on the floor of the UN. There are sanctions imposed. The world collectively raises its voice, as it did when chemical weapons were used in Syria last year, to denounce their use. And that limits their use. It means that arms companies don't sell them, they don't proliferate, and it means that they are used only in very limited fashion. And that's what I suspect we could hope to achieve with autonomous weapons, that we would make it the norm, we'd make it unacceptable, morally unacceptable to use them. And that will be the beginnings of regulating. From that, most things follow. It follows that arms companies won't be selling them. Arms companies don't sell you chemical weapons. Arms companies don't sell you blinding lasers. Arms companies don't sell you, most of them don't sell you cluster munitions because they're banned. And there's plentiful things that than getting on a UN blacklist to do that will make an arms company money. So you can't stop these technologies being misused, just like you can't stop terrorists making themselves chemical weapons. But if we make it the norm, that will severely limit their use and make the world a better place.
In terms of the technology?
in terms of technology, the last place you want to put a robot is on the battlefield. It's the most uncertain adversarial environment. There's a good reason that robots turned up in factories to begin with, in car factories and like, it's because that's a controlled environment. We can control who goes in there. We can control exactly everything going on, and no one's trying to work against us. The last place, if you ask one of my robotic colleagues, that we want to put an autonomous system is in the battlefield, where people are trying to kill you. And your opponent is trying to fool you all the time. It's the most uncertain place, and certainly we have a long way to go before we could build systems that would reliably be able to, follow. It's not clear we would ever be able to build systems that would reliably be able to follow international humanitarian law, that would reliably be able to distinguish between combatant and civilian, that would be able to act proportionally. These are things that we don't have answers to today, and it's not clear to me we will ever adequately be able to meet the standard of international humanitarian law.
And maybe, I'm sorry, I'm just trying, maybe my question is, there is a I understand the uncertainty issue of battlefield.
And your opponent's trying to deceive you.
Right.
Right.
So
No.
but when you're talking about being unable to distinguish combatant from non-combatant, I mean, is there is it more of a software issue here? Is this a hardware issue? Obviously, there is something that has kept it from being done, and it's not you guys.
It's entirely a software issue, right? I mean, we've got weapon systems that can fly and do with precision, guided by humans, to meet the standards that we have as good as they are to fight war, right? So what we're talking about is removing that human oversight and actually having algorithms make those decisions. Algorithms are not, every day you open the newspaper, you read news stories about how algorithms make mistakes. And we're talking about algorithms making terrible mistakes, the ones that you can't undo.
We have a briefing on that tomorrow, the algorithms making mistakes. I think our next question was in the fourth row. Thanks, Paul.
Hi, my name is Benny Mol, science journalist from the Netherlands, specialized in robotics and AI. I have a question both for Peter and Mary. You both mentioned meaningful human control. Can you explain what it is, maybe with examples? Because I'm afraid that different countries or different institutions might interpret it in a different way.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different components to it. So one is to avoid a sort of trivial human involvement. You can imagine somebody sitting in a dark room and a light comes on and they press a button, and you sort of have a human who's an automaton in some larger system, but doesn't understand that what they're actually authorizing some remote system to do. And so the meaningful part means that they can understand the situational context in which a target is being designated, can verify that it is in fact a lawful target, and that there is a military necessity to use lethal force against that target, and can authorize that. And that also carries then a component of accountability and responsibility. They have to have enough information about the situation to be accountable for the use of that weapon and ensure that it's being used appropriately. So as you get away from that, as you automate more and more things, then it becomes more difficult to hold an individual accountable. It becomes much more difficult to predict what a system is going to do in complex environments. And that's where you get a lot of this uncertainty and dangerous kinds of consequences.
Perhaps just to follow up, the Netherlands has taken a different approach to meaningful human control. It views the entire life cycle of the weapon. As long as that's under some form of human control, then that would be sufficient for the Netherlands. And it's the argument that they make for, not creating new international law at this point. But for us, that entire process is too much, and we're not trying to prohibit the entire life cycle of a weapon system. We're focusing very carefully on those critical functions of selecting and attacking targets. The best way for countries to find agreement on meaningful human control of weapon systems is to negotiate. This is why we call for the launch of negotiations on a new international instrument. Otherwise, the current talks will be inconclusive. They've got to have a goal to work towards, and that's why we're calling on the Netherlands and other countries to stop sitting on the fence here. and do something about this. And it's not just us and civil society and the scientific community saying this, it's actually the militaries in certain European states now that are getting annoyed because we're holding up acquisition and development processes with this question. And these military planners, they work long term and they don't want to sink millions of dollars into a weapon system that could ultimately be prohibited.
Maybe while we're waiting for our next question, Mary, I think you mentioned that 28 countries support the ban. Before that was 28. Were there any examples in diplomatic talks of some countries communicating arguments that convinced and brought over other countries to support the ban that are exemplary of the kinds of communications and diplomacy you would want to see going forward?
Pakistan was the first country to call for a ban on fully autonomous weapons. It said, in essence, as a victim of armed drone attacks, if this is what's coming next, we want no part of it. And they've been very forceful in reiterating their objections over the years. And they've been joined by a number of countries from Latin America, from Africa, and now from Europe, the Holy See and Austria. So it's a dispersed list. Its majority are developing countries who are very concerned at what they see happening with the military powers right now. And they realize that it's not going to remain, this tech is not going to remain in the hands of just a couple of states. Once it proliferates, it'll proliferate widely. And so the current diplomatic talks look like they're, from our perspective, doomed because of this abuse of the consensus rule. So now we're actively discussing with countries the other potential pathways forward. One is through the United Nations, as was done recently with the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. Another is a standalone process, such as the ones that I was involved in, to prohibit anti-personnel landmines and cluster bombs. And, you know, since we created those treaties, I've spent the last 2 decades monitoring and ensuring that they are implemented by states. So we do see cheating in the form of non-state armed groups creating improvised landmines at the moment, but the vast majority of stockpiled mines held by states parties have now been destroyed. Millions of mines have been destroyed from stocks. Thousands of victims have now got much better access to medical treatment. Clearance is up around the world in terms of removing the mines from the ground. So it's a positive picture, even if you do not get the major powers on board.
Dr. Walsh, I'm just to follow up on your talking about the hackathon. One, when will that be? And two, maybe I misheard you, but if you're trying to, in the hackathon, show how this can be done, how does actually solving maybe some of these algorithm problems prevent this? Won't you be speeding it up if you're showing, oh, this is an easier way to do it? It seems sort of counterproductive, isn't it?
I expected that question. So the hackathon is going to run in Science Week, National Science Week in Australia, it's in the middle of August this year. And there are, in the hackathon, we list the plentiful good uses the same technology is going to be used. In fact, already we're using such drones to drop lifebuoys on swimmers in distress. They're already being used to drop blood supplies in Africa where roads are. So, as I said, there are plenty of good things. We're not going to be publishing the algorithms at any rate. We're just exposing how, if you had malicious intent and you wanted to go and build these things, what you could do today, and to show that it's not actually that far away.
Okay, so I have to ask, have you tried, and how far have you gotten in
As I said, it's an observational experiment, I suspect.
But I mean, you must. It sounds like you may have tried this already.
No, I haven't tried it, but I'm not. So it's a graded series of tasks of increasing autonomy. I don't expect us to get to the end of the series of tasks with full autonomy and everything, but I expect the participants will get some way through.
Question here.
I was hoping you could expand on the idea that it could actually increase, that having killer robots in the battlefield could increase the likelihood of conflict. Could you kind of expand on that scenario.
Sure. So I think there's a few different ways. One of the things that, one of the ways might be that it lowers the threshold for going to war. So you're able to stockpile lots of things. You don't think you're going to have as many casualties on your side. It becomes more of an economic equation, and this could make a war more likely. Then there's the sort of psychological effect of thinking that you have a military superiority over your adversaries, and you want to utilize it before they gain a countermeasure to that kind of superiority, or vice versa, that you see your competitor nation about to get or acquire a strategic advantage and you want to preempt that. And so you get those sorts of instabilities. I think you also have the potential, once you have a lot of these systems free-ranging and doing border patrols, things like that, they may encounter each other. They may initiate a conflict where no military or political decision-making was really behind that. They just automatically initiate. They could also escalate the level of a conflict in that way. And we've seen certain parallels in things like the flash crash in the stock market, where you have competitive algorithms working against each other, getting into a positive feedback loop that at one point destroyed something like 40% of the value of the stock market in a couple of hours, and they had to reset the whole system back in 2010. So those sorts of things, and then your sort of more traditional kinds of arms race competitions that could also create instability. Because there's a lot of uncertainty around just what sort of capabilities these systems might have, what might be effective. And I'm more critical of the notion that the only way to counter these autonomous weapons is to have your own autonomous weapons. And we've seen that argument made with previous weapons of mass destruction. But it's still not clear that the best way to counter a nuclear attack is another nuclear attack, or to counter a chemical attack is another chemical attack, or biological versus biological. There's other ways and methods to retaliate. And if you look at counter-drone operations, it's much more effective just to try to knock the drones out of the sky than to build a whole other army of drones to engage the initial drones.
I should also point out, once the drones become autonomous, it's actually going to be much more difficult to defend yourself against them. Because at the moment, most drone defenses, so in Gatwick and Heathrow, when they were trying to bring those drones down, that was with radar jamming. Well, if it's autonomous, there's no radar to jam. So it makes the problem of counter-defense actually much more difficult if they become autonomous.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, thank you so much to our speakers today. This was a great briefing. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.